Elvis stood in the wings of the Ryman Auditorium and knew with absolute certainty that he was bombing. The applause was polite, just polite, not enthusiastic, not excited, just the kind of respectful clapping you give someone because that's what you do at concerts, not because you actually felt anything. It was October 2nd, 1954, and 19-year-old Elvis Presley was making his debut at the Grand Ole Opry, the most important stage in country music. This was supposed to be his big break, the moment that would launch him from regional curiosity to national star. Instead, it was becoming the most humiliating experience of his young life. The Opry audience sat there in the historic Ryman, the mother church of country music, and they weren't screaming, weren't standing, weren't reacting the way audiences in Memphis had been reacting. They were just sitting there, watching this kid with the weird hair and the strange movements, waiting for him to finish so they could get to the acts they'd actually come to see. Look at this moment. This is where we begin. Not with triumph, but with public failure witnessed by everyone who matters in country music. With a 19-year-old kid realizing in real time that the dream he'd been chasing might be impossible. Sam Phillips had worked hard to get Elvis this spot. Sam, the owner of Sun Records, who'd discovered Elvis just a few months earlier, who'd recorded That's All Right and Blue Moon of Kentucky, and watched them become regional hits. Sam believed in Elvis completely, believed he was going to change music, and Sam had connections at the Opry through the radio station connections, through the networks that kept the music industry connected in 1954. Getting Elvis on the Opry had seemed like the logical next step. The singles were selling well in the South. The reaction at local shows had been incredible, especially from young women, who screamed and carried on in ways that hadn't been seen before in country music venues. This kid had something special. The Opry needed to see it. Once they saw it, once Elvis performed on that legendary stage, everything would fall into place. Except it wasn't falling into place. The Opry audience skewed older, more traditional. They came to hear classic country, performed the way it was supposed to be performed. Singers standing at microphones, maybe strumming guitars, delivering songs with respect and restraint. Elvis didn't do respect and restraint. Elvis moved. Elvis brought rock and roll energy to country songs. Elvis was something new. And the Opry audience wasn't interested in something new. They wanted what they knew, what they'd always known, what felt safe and familiar, and right. Elvis finished his first song, Blue Moon of Kentucky, the Bill Monroe bluegrass standard that Elvis had transformed into something faster and more aggressive. The applause was tepid, scattered. A few people clapped enthusiastically, but most were just being polite. Elvis could hear the difference between polite applause and genuine excitement. He'd heard genuine excitement plenty of times in the past few months. This wasn't it. Notice how the first loop opens here. Can Elvis win over the Opry audience? Can he translate the success he's had in Memphis to this bigger, more important stage? Can he prove he belongs in the country music establishment? He sang his second song. The response was no better. If anything, it was worse, because now people knew what to expect and were confirming their initial lack of interest. This strange kid with his slick back hair and his legs shaking and his different approach to their music, he wasn't what they wanted, wasn't what the Opry was about. Backstage after his set, Elvis knew before anyone said anything. You can feel failure in your bones, can feel the weight of disappointment from people who'd believed in you and just watched you not deliver. Sam Phillips found him and tried to be encouraging, but they both knew the truth. The Opry debut had been a disaster. Then Jim Denny showed up. Jim Denny, the manager of the Grand Ole Opry, the man who decided who got to come back and who didn't. The gatekeeper. Elvis saw him coming and straightened up, tried to look professional, despite feeling like he wanted to disappear. "Son," Denny said, and his tone was kind but firm. "The way you talk to someone when you're about to deliver bad news they need to hear. That wasn't what we're looking for here." Elvis nodded, didn't trust himself to speak yet. "You ought to go back to Memphis," Denny continued. "Maybe stick with truck driving. This music business, it's not for everyone. And what you're doing, it's not what the Opry is about. Wait. Feel the weight of those words. Go back to driving trucks. In other words, give up. You tried. You failed. Go back to your day job and forget about this music dream. You don't have what it takes." Elvis just stood there and took it. What else could he do? Argue? Tell the manager of the Grand Ole Opry that he was wrong, that Elvis was going to be huge, that the Opry was making a mistake. He was 19 years old. He'd been making music professionally for 3 months. Jim Denny had been in the business for decades. Who was Elvis to argue? "Yes, sir," Elvis managed to say. "Thank you for the opportunity." He walked away before the emotion hit, found a quiet corner backstage where nobody could see him, and let the devastation wash over him. This was supposed to be his moment. His big break, the thing that would prove to everyone, his parents, his friends, the kids at his old high school, who'd thought he was weird, that he was special, that the music mattered. Instead he'd bombed, been told he wasn't good enough, been advised to quit and go back to driving a truck for Crown Electric Company. The second loop opens now. What happens when your dream gets rejected? When the authority figures in your chosen field tell you you're not good enough? Do you listen to them and quit, or do you keep going despite their judgment? Scotty Moore and Bill Black, Elvis's guitarist and bassist, found him eventually. They'd witnessed the whole thing, the lukewarm response from the audience, the conversation with Jim Denny, Elvis's devastated reaction. They didn't know what to say. How do you comfort someone who just had their biggest opportunity turn into public humiliation? "Man, that was rough," Bill said finally. Elvis nodded, not trusting his voice yet. "But Memphis loved you," Scotty offered. "The Bon Air, the Eagle's Nest, those crowds went crazy. This was just wrong crowd, wrong venue. Doesn't mean anything. But it felt like it meant everything. The Grand Ole Opry was the top. If you couldn't make it there, what did all the local success matter? What did it mean to have teenagers screaming at small clubs if the industry gatekeepers told you you weren't good enough?" The drive back to Memphis was quiet. Elvis sat in the passenger seat and stared out the window at the dark Tennessee landscape and wondered if Jim Denny was right. Maybe this music thing wasn't going to work out. Maybe he should go back to Crown Electric, tell them he'd made a mistake leaving, ask for his driving job back. At least that was steady. At least he'd been good at it. His mother Gladys saw his face when he got home and knew immediately what had happened. "Baby," she said, and wrapped him in a hug. "Tell me." "I wasn't good enough," Elvis said, and his voice cracked. "The Opry, they didn't want me. Jim Denny told me I should go back to driving trucks." Gladys held him tighter. "Jim Denny doesn't know everything. He knows the Opry. He knows country music. And he said I'm not good enough." "Then maybe the Opry isn't where you belong," Gladys said. "Maybe you're meant for something different, something they haven't seen before." But that didn't make the rejection hurt less. Didn't make Elvis feel any better about bombing on the most important stage in country music. Didn't change the fact that he'd failed publicly in front of everyone who mattered. Notice how the third loop opens. The internal battle. Can Elvis recover from this rejection psychologically? Can he rebuild his confidence after being told by an authority figure that he should quit? The next day Sam Phillips called. "I know last night was rough," Sam said, "but we're not done. There's another show I want you to try for. Louisiana Hayride, broadcast out of Shreveport. It's not as big as the Opry, but it's important, and I think the audience will be different. Younger, more open to what you're doing." Elvis wanted to say no, wanted to protect himself from another public humiliation, but he also couldn't quite let go of the dream, couldn't quite accept Jim Denny's verdict as final. "When?" he asked. "October 16th. 2 weeks from now. That gives you time to recover. Time to get ready. 2 weeks. 14 days to either rebuild his confidence or talk himself out of trying again." The Louisiana Hayride was different from the Opry in important ways. It was younger, less established, more willing to take risks on new sounds. The Opry represented tradition and preservation. The Hayride represented evolution and discovery. Artists who didn't quite fit the Opry mold often found homes at the Hayride first. Elvis spent those 2 weeks practicing, rehearsing, trying to figure out what had gone wrong at the Opry. Was it the material? His performance? The way he moved? Should he change everything? Try to be more traditional? More acceptable to mainstream country audiences? Sam Phillips gave him advice that would prove crucial. Don't change what you're doing. You bombed at the Opry because you're different, not because you're bad. The Hayride audience will get it. Just be yourself. Easy to say. Harder to believe after being told to go back to truck driving. October 16th, 1954. Elvis drove to Shreveport, Louisiana, with Scotty and Bill. The municipal auditorium where the Hayride was broadcast looked different from the Ryman, more modern, less historic, less weight of tradition pressing down. But Elvis was still nervous, still carrying the memory of the Opry disaster, still hearing Jim Denny's words, "Go back to driving trucks." Backstage, Frank Page, one of the Hayride's hosts, greeted them. "Heard you had a rough night at the Opry," he said, not unkindly. "Yes, sir," Elvis admitted. "Their loss," Frank said simply. "Let's see what you've got." The Hayride audience was different from minute one. Younger, more energetic, less concerned with how things were supposed to be, and more interested in how things could be. When Elvis walked out and started performing, the reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Screaming. Real screaming. Not polite applause. Young women standing up, pointing, reacting to every move Elvis made. The energy in the room completely different from what he'd experienced at the Opry. This felt like the Memphis crowds. This felt like people who understood what he was doing. Look at this shift. 2 weeks earlier, Elvis had been told to quit. Now he was getting the reaction he'd been hoping for at the Opry. The same performance, the same material, but a completely different response, because the audience was ready for something new instead of defending something old. Elvis finished his set to thunderous applause and cheering. Backstage, the Hayride producers told him they wanted him back. Not just once, they wanted him to become a regular, $18 per show, which wasn't much, but it was consistent work, a platform, a place that wanted him. The first loop closes. No, Elvis couldn't win over the Opry audience. But the question was wrong. The real question was whether there was an audience somewhere that would get what he was doing, and the answer was yes. The Louisiana Hayride became Elvis's home base for the next year. Every Saturday night, he performed on the show, broadcast across the South and into the Midwest. The reaction kept building. More letters came in requesting Elvis specifically. More people tuned in to hear this strange new singer, who moved differently and sounded different and made teenagers lose their minds. 3 weeks after the Opry told him to go back to driving trucks, Elvis was a regular on a major radio program. 6 months after that, the Hayride renegotiated his contract to $200 per show, more than 10 times his original rate. A year after the Opry rejection, RCA Records bought his contract from Sun Records for $40,000, an unprecedented sum for a new artist. The second loop closes. What do you do when gatekeepers reject you? You find a different gate. You find the people who do understand what you're offering. You keep going until you prove the rejecting authorities wrong. By 1956, Elvis Presley was the biggest star in America. He'd appeared on national television. His records topped the charts. Ed Sullivan, who'd sworn he'd never have Elvis on his show, paid him $50,000 for 3 appearances. The kid who'd been told to go back to truck driving was making more money in a week than most people made in a year. And the Grand Ole Opry, they never quite figured out what to do with Elvis. He was too big to ignore, too different from their tradition to embrace. They'd had their chance and passed, told him he wasn't good enough, sent him away. Elvis never held it against them publicly. Never bad-mouthed the Opry or Jim Denny. When asked about that night years later, he'd just say it hadn't been the right fit. That's all. No hard feelings. But everyone in the industry knew what had happened, knew the Opry had turned away the biggest star in music, because he didn't fit their expectations. The third loop closes. Elvis recovered psychologically from the rejection by finding validation elsewhere, by proving through success that Jim Denny's judgment had been wrong. The confidence came back not through self-talk, but through results. The story becomes a lesson that every artist learns eventually. The gatekeepers don't know everything. The authorities who seem to hold all the power, who can make or break careers with a word. They're just people making judgments based on their own limited perspectives and biases. Sometimes they're right. Sometimes they're catastrophically wrong. Jim Denny looked at Elvis Presley and saw a kid who didn't fit the Opry tradition. Saw someone doing something different and concluded that different meant wrong. Told that kid to give up and go back to driving trucks. And in doing so became forever known as the man who rejected Elvis Presley. The takeaway. Rejection from authority figures feels like the end of the world when you're on the receiving end. When someone with power and expertise tells you you're not good enough, every insecurity you have gets validated. Every doubt becomes louder. The voice in your head that says, maybe they're right, maybe I should quit, becomes almost impossible to ignore. Elvis stood backstage at the Grand Ole Opry and heard Jim Denny, the manager of the most important venue in country music, tell him to go back to driving trucks, to give up on music, to accept that he didn't have what it takes. And for a moment, Elvis believed it. felt the crushing weight of authoritative rejection, wondered if the dream was over before it had really begun. But rejection from one gatekeeper doesn't mean rejection from everyone. It just means you haven't found your audience yet, haven't found the people who understand what you're offering. The Opry audience in 1954 wanted traditional country music performed traditionally. Elvis was offering something new that didn't fit their expectations. That wasn't Elvis's failure. It was a mismatch. 3 weeks later, at the Louisiana Hayride, Elvis found his audience, found the people who were ready for something different, found the platform that would launch him from regional success to national phenomenon. Not because he changed what he was doing, but because he found the right place for what he was already doing. The gatekeepers, the Jim Dennis of the world, have power, but their power is limited. They can close one door. They can't close all doors. They can say no to you at their venue, with their audience, according to their standards. They can't determine your worth or your future unless you let them. Elvis could have listened to Jim Denny, could have gone back to Crown Electric Company, asked for his truck driving job back, given up on the music dream. He was 19 years old. He had no reason to trust his own judgment over someone with decades of industry experience. Accepting Denny's verdict would have been the safe, rational choice. But he didn't. He felt the devastation of rejection, let himself hurt from it, then kept going anyway, found another stage, found another audience, found another chance, and turned rejection from the most important venue in country music into the beginning of the biggest career in music history. October 2nd, 1954. The night the Grand Ole Opry told Elvis to go back to driving trucks. The night that seemed like career-ending humiliation turned out to be just a minor detour on the way to something much bigger than the Opry could have offered anyway. The night Elvis learned that gatekeepers only control the gates they're standing at. And there are always other gates if you're willing to keep looking. Sometimes the best thing that can happen to you is getting rejected by people who would have constrained what you could become. Sometimes the door that closes saves you from a path that was too small for where you were headed. Sometimes no from the wrong people clears the way for yes from the right ones. Elvis went back to Memphis after the Opry rejection, but he didn't go back to driving trucks. He went back to find another way forward, and 3 weeks later, he found it.